Before we dive into one of the most fascinating diplomatic chess matches in history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. This is the story of how America won the peace after winning the war. How Benjamin Franklin, alone in Paris, outmaneuvered the greatest powers in Europe to secure a treaty that gave the United States everything it wanted and more. This is the story of how the American Revolution truly ended. The campaign in Virginia being finished, Washington and the Eastern Army were cantoned for the winter in their old positions around New York. Wayne, with the Pennsylvania line, marched to the south to reinforce Greene. The French, under Rochambeau, encamped in Virginia, and de Grasse took his fleet to the West Indies. As the hope of peace gained strength, Congress could not repress alarm at the extent of the control over the negotiations for it, which in the previous month of June had been granted to France. On the 7th of January 1782, Robert R. Livingston, the first American Secretary for Foreign Affairs, proving himself equal to the supreme responsibility devolved upon him, rose above every local interest or influence, and clearly representing the spirit of the people and the desires of Congress, communicated to the American Commissioners for Peace new instructions on its conditions. The boundaries on the east, the northeast, and the north were to be the ocean and the well-known line between the United States and Canada. On the west, the Mississippi. For the south, Livingston, foreseeing the dangers of restoring West Florida to Great Britain, with wise forethought declared that the interests of France and of the United States conspired to exclude Great Britain from both the Floridas. But no objection was made to their restoration to Spain. Livingston asserted the equal common rights of the United States to the fisheries on the banks of Newfoundland, yet not within such distance of the coasts of other powers as the law of nations allows them to appropriate. The sea, by its nature, cannot be appropriated. Its common benefits are the right of all mankind. The commissioners were further instructed that no stipulation must be made in favor of the American partisans of England who had been banished the country or whose property had been forfeited. Should the Floridas be ceded to Spain, it would be essential to fix their limits precisely, for which the directions of Congress of 1777 were made the rule. These instructions were received by Franklin in March. They carried joy to the old man's heart, and he answered, "Your communications of the sentiments of Congress with regard to a treaty of peace give me great pleasure, and the more as they agree so perfectly with my own opinions and furnish me with additional arguments in their support. My ideas on the points to be insisted on in the treaty of peace are, I assure you, full as strong as yours. Be assured I shall not willingly give up any important right or interest of our country, and unless this campaign should afford our enemies some considerable advantage, I hope more may be obtained than I yet expect. Let us keep not only our courage, but our vigilance." The action of Congress was slower, but not less firm. On the 17th of November, 1781, the delegates for Massachusetts laid before Congress the prayer of their state, that the right in the fisheries which had heretofore been enjoyed might be continued and secured. The subject was referred to Lovell of Massachusetts, Carroll of Maryland, and to Madison. The young Virginia statesman whose wisdom so often pointed out to his country the way of escape from embarrassment, took the lead in the committee, and the ultimatum of peace which he prepared merged the prayer of a single commonwealth in an ultimatum that included the interests of the nation. His report, which was made on the day after Livingston had written his instructions for the Commissioners for Peace, argued at large in favor of the same points. It was acceptable to Congress, but the decision of that body was long delayed. On the west, no boundary was to be known but the Mississippi. Congress regretted its instructions of June 1781 as a sacrifice of national dignity, but listening to the advice of Madison, it refused to reconsider them, choosing rather to proceed by supplementary instructions. After long delays and debates, on the 3rd day of October, Congress, by the vote of 9 states, declared that the territorial claims of the states, as heretofore made, their participation in the fisheries, and the free navigation of the Mississippi were not only their indubitable rights, but were essential to their prosperity, and they trusted that the efforts of His Most Christian Majesty would be successfully employed to obtain security for those rights. Nor could they refrain from setting before the King of France that no compensation could be made to the Royalist refugees for property confiscated in the several states, not only on account of the sovereignty of the individual states by which the confiscation had been made, but of the wanton devastation which the citizens of the states had experienced from the enemy, and in many instances from the very persons in whose favor such claims might be urged.
While the conditions of peace were under consideration, America obtained an avowed friend. Henry Lawrence, the American plenipotentiary to the Netherlands, having been taken captive and carried to England, John Adams was appointed in his place. The new envoy had waited more than 8 months for an audience of reception. Encouraged by the success at Yorktown, on the 9th of January, 1782, Adams presented himself to the President of the States General, renewed his formal request for an opportunity of presenting his credentials, and demanded a categorical answer which he might transmit to his sovereign. He next went in person to the deputies of the several cities of Holland, and following the order of their rank in the Confederation, repeated his demand to each one of them. The attention of Europe was drawn to the sturdy diplomatist who dared, alone and unsupported, to initiate so novel and bold a procedure. Not one of the representatives of foreign powers at The Hague believed that it could succeed. On the 26th of February, Friesland, whose people had retained in their own hands the election of their regencies, declared in favor of receiving the American envoy, and its vote was the index of the opinion of the nation. A month later, the states of Holland, yielding to petitions from all the principal towns, followed the example. Zeeland adhered on the 4th of April, Overijssel on the 5th, Groningen on the 9th, Utrecht on the 10th, and Gelderland on the 17th. On the day which chanced to be the 7th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington, their High Mightinesses, the States General, reporting the unanimous decision of the 7 provinces, resolved that John Adams should be received as the Minister of the United States of America. The Dutch Republic was the second power in the world to recognize their independence, and the act proceeded from heroic sympathy with a people in part descended from its own citizens and struggling against oppression after the example of its own ancestors. It gave new life to the public hope, especially in New York. On the 15th of June, John Adams found special pleasure in being formally presented to the family of which the first and the third William accomplished such great things for the Protestant religion and the rights of mankind. This country, so he wrote to a friend, appears to be more a home than any other that I have seen. I have often been to that church at Leyden, where the planters of Plymouth worshipped so many years ago, and felt a kind of veneration for the bricks and timbers. The liberal spirit that was prevailing in the world pleaded for America. The Emperor of Austria proclaimed in his dominions freedom of religion. If liberty was spreading through all realms, how much more should it make itself felt by the people of England, who regarded their own country as its chosen abode? It might suffer eclipse during the rage to recover their former transatlantic possessions by force, but the old love of freedom, which was confirmed by the struggle of centuries, must reassert its sway. The temper of the British mind was thoroughly changed. In the years which followed the peace of 1763, the profits of agriculture, manufactures, and commerce increased with accelerated speed. The new war which the aristocracy had kindled in attempting to save a shilling in the pound on their land tax by taxing the colonies through the agency of the British Parliament had doubled the national debt and more than doubled the amount of its yearly interest. Rents were declining. Land had fallen nearly 1/3 in price. The war narrowed the foreign markets for British manufactures. While Great Britain in 1775 was said to have employed in navigation about 7,000 vessels, New England privateers had before the end of 1782 captured nearly one-third of that number, of which more than 1,200, escaping recapture, arrived in safe ports. The nation had become involved in 4 wars and could no longer raise money to carry them on, so that if they continued, it might be driven to stop payment of the interest money on the funds and thus ruin their future credit. The king was cast down by the loss of the good wishes of nearly every great power in Europe. The governing class saw that their political influence on the course of events in Europe was gone and could not be recovered till the war should come to an end. Moreover, the difficulties in which Britain was involved had grown out of her departure from the principles which had made her the most successful colonizing nation of the world. Her colonies had succeeded because they took with them the liberties of the parent country. England was at war with her own traditions, and a ministry was in power which as little represented the liberal colonial policy of England as the Stuarts had represented its constitution. The kingdom was divided against itself. The success of America was needed for the future success of the principles of English liberty in England.
Before we dive into one of the most fascinating diplomatic chess matches in history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. This is the story of how America won the peace after winning the war. How Benjamin Franklin, alone in Paris, outmaneuvered the greatest powers in Europe to secure a treaty that gave the United States everything it wanted and more. This is the story of how the American Revolution truly ended. The campaign in Virginia being finished, Washington and the Eastern Army were cantoned for the winter in their old positions around New York. Wayne, with the Pennsylvania line, marched to the south to reinforce Greene. The French, under Rochambeau, encamped in Virginia, and de Grasse took his fleet to the West Indies. As the hope of peace gained strength, Congress could not repress alarm at the extent of the control over the negotiations for it, which in the previous month of June had been granted to France. On the 7th of January, 1782, Robert R. Livingston, the first American Secretary for Foreign Affairs, proving himself equal to the supreme responsibility devolved upon him, rose above every local interest or influence and clearly representing the spirit of the people and the desires of Congress, communicated to the American Commissioners for Peace new instructions on its conditions. The boundaries on the east, the northeast, and the north were to be the ocean and the well-known line between the United States and Canada. On the west, the Mississippi. For the south, Livingston, foreseeing the dangers of restoring West Florida to Great Britain, with wise forethought declared that the interests of France and of the United States conspired to exclude Great Britain from both the Floridas. But no objection was made to their restoration to Spain. Livingston asserted the equal common rights of the United States to the fisheries on the banks of Newfoundland, yet not within such distance of the coasts of other powers as the law of nations allows them to appropriate. The sea, by its nature, cannot be appropriated. Its common benefits are the right of all mankind. The commissioners were further instructed that no stipulation must be made in favor of the American partisans of England who had been banished the country or whose property had been forfeited. Should the Floridas be ceded to Spain, it would be essential to fix their limits precisely, for which the directions of Congress of 1777 were made the rule. These instructions were received by Franklin in March. They carried joy to the old man's heart, and he answered, "Your communications of the sentiments of Congress with regard to a treaty of peace give me great pleasure, and the more as they agree so perfectly with my own opinions and furnish me with additional arguments in their support. My ideas on the points to be insisted on in the treaty of peace are, I assure you, full as strong as yours.
Be assured I shall not willingly give up any important right or interest of our country, and unless this campaign should afford our enemies some considerable advantage, I hope more may be obtained than I yet expect. Let us keep not only our courage, but our vigilance." The action of Congress was slower but not less firm. On the 17th of November, 1781, the delegates from Massachusetts laid before Congress the prayer of their state that the right in the fisheries which had heretofore been enjoyed might be continued and secured. The subject was referred to Lovell of Massachusetts, Carroll of Maryland, and to Madison. The young Virginia statesman, whose wisdom so often pointed out to his country the way of escape from embarrassment, took the lead in the committee, and the ultimatum of peace which he prepared merged the prayer of a single commonwealth in an ultimatum that included the interests of the nation. His report, which was made the day after Livingston had written his instructions to the commissioners for peace, argued at large in favor of the same points. It was acceptable to Congress, but the decision of that body was long delayed. On the west, no boundary was to be known but the Mississippi. Congress regretted its instructions of June 1781 as a sacrifice of national dignity, but listening to the advice of Madison, it refused to reconsider them, choosing rather to proceed by supplementary instructions. After long delays and debates, on the 3rd day of October, Congress, by the vote of 9 states, declared that the territorial claims of the states, as heretofore made, their participation in the fisheries, and the free navigation of the Mississippi were not only their indubitable rights, but were essential to their prosperity. And they trusted that the efforts of His Most Christian Majesty would be successfully employed to obtain security for those rights. Nor could they refrain from setting before the King of France that no compensation could be made to the Royalist refugees for property confiscated in the several states, not only on account of the sovereignty of the individual states by which the confiscation had been made, but of the wanton devastation which the citizens of the states had experienced from the enemy, and in many instances from the very persons in whose favor such claims might be urged.
Lord North, having a few days before narrowly escaped a vote of censure, rose at the same moment with a member who was to have moved a want of confidence in the ministers. The two parties in the House shouted wildly the names of their respective champions. The Speaker hesitated, when Lord North, gaining the floor on a question of order, with good temper but visible emotion, announced that his administration was at an end. The outgoing ministry was the worst which England had known since Parliament had been supreme. Such a bunch of imbecility, said the author of Taxation No Tyranny, and he might have added of corruption, never disgraced the country, and he prayed and gave thanks that it was dissolved. Posterity has been toward Lord North more lenient and less just. America gained through his mismanagement independence and can bear him no grudge. In England, no party claimed him as their representative or saw fit to bring him to judgment, so that his scholarship, his unruffled temper, the purity of his private life, and good words from Burns, from Gibbon, and more than all from Macaulay, have retained for him among his countrymen a less evil repute as minister than he deserved. English opinion has decided that his administration no more deserves to be recognized as the expression of the British mind on the fit methods of colonial government than the policy of James II to be accepted as the exponent of English liberty. The people were not yet known in Parliament as a power, and outside of them 3 groups only could contribute members to an administration. The new Tory or Conservative Party, toward which the Whigs, represented by Portland and Burke, were gravitating, had at that time for its most conspicuous and least scrupulous defender the Chancellor Thurlow. The followers of Chatham, of whom it was the cardinal principle that the British Constitution recognizes a king and a people no less than a hereditary aristocracy, and that to prevent the overbearing weight of that aristocracy, the king should sustain the people, owned Shelburne as their standard-bearer.
In point of years, experience, philosophic culture, and superiority to ambition as a passion, he was their fittest leader, though he had never enjoyed the intimate friendship of their departed chief. It was he who reconciled George III to the lessons of Adam Smith and recommended them to the younger Pitt, through whom they passed to Sir Robert Peel. But his habits of study and his want of skill in parliamentary tactics had kept him from political connections as well as from political intrigues. His respect for the monarchical element in the British Constitution invited the slander that he was only a counterfeit liberal, at heart devoted to the king. But in truth, he was very sincere. His reputation has comparatively suffered with posterity, for no party has taken charge of his fame. Moreover, being more liberal than his age, his speeches sometimes had an air of ambiguity from his attempt to present his views in a form that might clash as little as possible with the prejudices of his hearers.
The third set was that of the old Whigs, which had governed England from the Revolution till the coming in of George III, and which deemed itself invested with a right to govern forever. Its principle was the paramount power of the aristocracy. Its office, as Rockingham expressed it, to fight up against king and people. They claimed to be liberal, and many of them were so, but they were more willing to act as the trustees of the people than with the people and by the people. Like the great Roman lawyers, the best of them meant to be true to their clients, but never respected them as their equals. An enduring liberal government could at that time be established in England only by a junction of the party then represented by Shelburne and the liberal wing of the supporters of Rockingham. Such a union Chatham for 20 years had striven to bring about. The king kept his sorrows, as well as he could, pent up in his own breast, but his mind was truly torn to pieces by the inflexible resolve of the House of Commons to stop the war in America. He blamed them for having lost the feelings of Englishmen. Moreover, he felt keenly the cruel usage of all the powers of Europe, of whom every one adhered to the principles of the armed neutrality, and every great one but Spain desired the perfect emancipation of the United States. The day after the ministry announced its retirement, he proposed to Shelburne to take the administration with Thurlow, Gower, and Weymouth, Camden, Grafton, and Rockingham. This Shelburne declined as absolutely impracticable, and from an equal regard to the quiet of the sovereign and the good of the country, he urged the king to send for Rockingham. The king could not prevail with himself to accept the advice, and he spoke discursively of his shattered health, his agitation of mind, his low opinion of Rockingham's understanding, his horror of Charles Fox, his preference of Shelburne as compared with the rest of the opposition. For a day he contemplated calling in a number of principal persons, among whom Rockingham might be included, and when the many objections to such a measure were pointed out, he still refused to meet Rockingham face to face, and could not bring himself further than to receive him through the intervention of Shelburne. In this state of things, Shelburne consented to be the bearer of a message from the king with authority to procure the assistance and cooperation of the Rockinghams, cost what it would, more or less. Necessity, relates the king, made me yield to the advice of Lord Shelburne. Before accepting the treasury, Rockingham made but one great proposition, that there should be no veto to the independence of America. The king, though in bitterness of spirit, consented in writing to the demand. I was thoroughly resolved, he says of himself, not to open my mouth on any negotiation with America. In constructing a ministry, composed it of members from both branches of the Liberal party. His own connection was represented by himself, Fox, Cavendish, Keppel, and Richmond, but as Chancellor he retained Thurlow, who bore Shelburne malice and had publicly received the glowing eulogies of Fox.
Shelburne took with him into the cabinet Camden, and as a balance to Thurlow, the great lawyer Dunning, raising him to the peerage as Lord Ashburton. Conway and Grafton might be esteemed as neutral, having both been members alike of the Rockingham and the Chatham administrations. Men of the next generation asked why Burke was offered no seat in the cabinet. The new Tory party would give power to any man, however born, that proved himself an able defender of their fortress. The old Whig party reserved the highest places for those cradled in the purple. "I have no views to become a minister," Burke said, "nor have I any right to such views. I am a man who have no pretensions to it from fortune." And he was happy with the rich office of paymaster for himself and lucrative places for his kin. Franklin, in Paris, carefully watched the changes of opinions in the House of Commons and saw clearly that Shelburne must be a member of the new administration. Already on the 22nd of March, 1782, through a traveler returning to England, he opened a correspondence with his friend of many years, assuring him of the continuance of his own ancient respect for his talents and virtues, and congratulating him on the returning good disposition of his country for America. "I hope," continued he, "it will tend to produce a general peace, which I am sure your lordship with all good men desires, which I wish to see before I die, and to which I shall with infinite pleasure contribute everything in my power." This overture arrived most opportunely. Shelburne, as the elder Secretary of State having his choice, elected the Home Department, which then included America, so that he had by right the direction of all measures relating to the United States. On the 4th of April, he instructed Sir Guy Carleton to proceed to New York with all possible expedition, and he would not suffer Arnold to return to the land which he had bargained to betray. On the same day, he had an interview with Lawrence, then in England as a prisoner on parole, and having learned of him the powers of the American commissioners, before evening he selected for the diplomatic agent to treat with them Richard Oswald of Scotland. The king, moved by the acceptable part which Shelburne had acted in the whole negotiation for forming the present administration, deviated from his purpose of total silence and gave his approval alike to the attempt to sound Mr. Franklin and to the employment of Oswald, who had passed many years in America, understood it well, on questions of commerce agreed with Adam Smith, and now engaged in the business disinterestedly. By him, writing as friend to friend, Shelburne answered the overture of Franklin in words which are the key to the treaty that followed. London, 6th April, 1782. Dear Sir, I have been favored with your letter and am much obliged by your remembrance. I find myself returned nearly to the same situation which you remember me to have occupied 19 years ago. And I should be very glad to talk to you, as I did then and afterward in 1767, upon the means of promoting the happiness of mankind, a subject much more agreeable to my nature than the best concerted plans for spreading misery and devastation.
I have had a high opinion of the compass of your mind and of your foresight. I have often been beholden to both, and shall be glad to be so again as far as is compatible with your situation. Your letter, discovering the same disposition, has made me send to you Mr. Oswald. I have had a longer acquaintance with him than even with you. I believe him an honorable man, and after consulting some of our common friends, I have thought him the fittest for the purpose. He is a pacifical man, and conversant in those negotiations which are most interesting to mankind. This has made me prefer him to any of our speculative friends or to any person of higher rank. He is fully apprised of my mind, and you may give full credit to anything he assures you of. At the same time, if any other channel occurs to you, I am ready to embrace it. I wish to retain the same simplicity and good faith which subsisted between us in transactions of less importance. Shelburne. With this credential, Oswald repaired to Paris by way of Ostend. Lawrence, proceeding to The Hague, found John Adams planning how to obtain a loan of money for the United States and to negotiate a treaty of commerce and a triple alliance. Besides, believing that Shelburne was not in earnest, he was willing to wait till the British nation should be ripe for peace. In this manner, the American negotiation was left in the hands of Franklin alone. The dread of the United States of America became every day more intense in Spain from the desperate weakness of her authority in her transatlantic possessions. Her rule was hated in them all, and as even her allies confessed, with good reason. The seeds of rebellion were already sown in the viceroyalties of Buenos Aires and Peru, and a union of Creoles and Indians might at any moment prove fatal to metropolitan dominion. French statesmen were of opinion that England, by emancipating Spanish America, might indemnify itself for the independence of a part of its own colonial empire, and they foresaw in such a revolution the greatest benefit to the commerce of their own country. Immense naval preparations had been made by the Bourbons for the conquest of Jamaica, but now, from the fear of spreading the love of change, Florida Blanca suppressed every wish to acquire that hated nest of contraband trade. When the French ambassador, in April, reported to him the proposal of Vergennes to constitute its inhabitants an independent republic, he seemed to hear the tocsin of insurrection sounding from the La Plata to San Francisco, and from that time had nothing to propose for the employment of the Allied fleets in the West Indies. He was perplexed beyond the power of extrication. One hope only remained. Minorca having been wrested from the English, he concentrated all the force of Spain in Europe on the recovery of Gibraltar, and compelled the aid of France through her promise not to make peace until that fortress should be given up. Measures for a general peace must therefore begin with America, as the pacification of the late British dependencies belonged to the department of Lord Shelburne. The cabinet as a body respected his right to conduct the negotiation with the United States. But Fox, leagued with young men as uncontrollable as himself, resolved to fasten a quarrel upon him and to get into his own hands every part of the negotiations for peace.
At a cabinet meeting on the 12th of April, he told Shelburne and those who sided with him that he was determined to bring the matter to a crisis. And on the same day he wrote to one of his young friends, "They must yield entirely. If they do not, we must go to war again. That is all. I am sure I am ready." Oswald at that moment was on his way to Paris, where on the 16th he went straightway to Franklin. The latter, speaking not his own opinion only, but that of Congress and of every one of his associate commissioners, explained that the United States could not treat for peace with Great Britain unless it was likewise intended to treat with France. And though Oswald desired to keep aloof from European affairs, he allowed himself to be introduced by Franklin to Vergennes, who received with pleasure assurances of the good disposition of the British king, reciprocated them on the part of his own sovereign, and invited an offer of its conditions. He wished America and France to treat directly with British plenipotentiaries, each for itself, the two negotiations to move on with equal step, and the two treaties to be simultaneously signed. In the instruction to the Peace Plenipotentiary of the United States in August 1779, Congress wrote, "It is of the utmost importance to the peace and commerce of the United States that Canada and Nova Scotia should be ceded, yet a desire of terminating the war has induced us not to make the acquisition an ultimatum." From Amsterdam, John Adams questioned whether with Canada and Nova Scotia in the hands of the English, the Americans could ever have a real peace.
In a like spirit, Franklin, taking every precaution to keep this suggestion from the knowledge of the French government, entrusted to Oswald notes for conversation, in which the voluntary cession of Canada was suggested as the surety of a durable peace and a sweet reconciliation. At the same time, he replied to his old friend Lord Shelburne, "I desire no other channel of communication between us than that of Mr. Oswald, which I think your lordship has chosen with much judgment. He will be witness of my acting with all sincerity and good faith which you do me the honor to expect from me. And if he is enabled, when he returns hither, to communicate more fully your lordship's mind on the principal points to be settled, I think it may contribute much to the blessed work our hearts are engaged in." Another great step was taken by Franklin. He excluded Spain altogether from the American negotiation, and as Adams was detained in Holland, and Jefferson was not in Europe, and Lawrence was a prisoner on parole, in a pressing matter he entreated Jay, his only remaining colleague, to come to Paris, writing, "I wish you here as soon as possible. You would be of infinite service. Spain has taken 4 years to consider whether she should treat with us or not. Give her 40, and let us in the meantime mind our own business. I am, my dear friend, most affectionately yours." On the 23rd, shortly after the return of Oswald to London, the cabinet, on his report, agreed to send him again to Franklin to acquaint him of their readiness to treat at Paris for a general peace, conceding American independence, but otherwise maintaining the treaties of 1763. On the 28th, Shelburne, who was in earnest, gave to his agent the verbal instruction, if America is independent, she must be so of the whole world, with no ostensible, tacit, or secret connection with France. Canada could not be ceded. It was reasonable to expect a free trade, unencumbered with duties, to every part of America. Words which, as used in those days, meant only that British ships should be admitted to every American entry port without any discriminating duty. All debts due to British subjects were to be secure, and the Loyalists to be restored to a full enjoyment of their rights and privileges. As a compensation for the restoration of New York, Charleston, and Savannah, the river Penobscot might be proposed for the eastern boundary of New England.
Finally, he said, "Tell Dr. Franklin candidly and confidentially Lord Shelburne's situation with the king, that his lordship will make no use of it but to keep his word with mankind." With these instructions, Oswald returned immediately to Paris, bearing from Shelburne to Franklin a most friendly letter to which the king had given his thorough approval. With the European belligerents, the communication was necessarily to proceed from the Department of State for Foreign Affairs, of which Fox was the chief. He entered upon the business in a spirit that foreboded no success, for at the moment of his selection of an emissary, he declared that he did not think it much signified how soon he should break up the cabinet. The person of whom he made choice to treat on the weightiest interests with the most skillful diplomatist of Europe was Thomas Grenville, one of his own partisans, a young man of an active and penetrating mind, but with no experience in public business and a scant knowledge of the foreign relations of his own country. Arriving in Paris on the 8th of May, Grenville delivered to Franklin a most cordial letter of introduction from Fox and met with the heartiest welcome. On the next morning, Franklin, after receiving him at breakfast, took him in his own carriage to Versailles, and there the dismissed Postmaster General for America, at the request of the British Secretary of State, introduced the son of the author of the American Stamp Act as the British plenipotentiary to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Bourbon King. Statesmen at Paris and Vienna were amused on hearing that the envoy of the rebel colonies was become the introductor of the representatives of Great Britain at the court of Versailles. Vergennes received Grenville most cordially as the nephew of an old friend, but smiled at his offer to grant to France the independence of the United States, and Franklin refused to accept at second hand that independence which his country had already won.
Grenville remarked that the war had been provoked by encouragement from France to the Americans to revolt, to which Vergennes answered with warmth that France had found and not made America independent, and that American independence was not the only cause of the war. On the 10th, Grenville, unaccompanied by Franklin, met Vergennes and Aranda and offered peace on the basis of the independence of the United States and the Treaty of 1763. "That treaty," said Vergennes, "I can never read without a shudder. The king, my master, cannot in any treaty consider the independence of America as ceded to him. To do so would be injurious to the dignity of his Britannic Majesty." The Spanish ambassador urged with vehemence that the griefs of the King of Spain were totally distinct from the independence of America. With regard to America, the frequent conversations of the young envoy with Franklin, who received him with constant hospitality, cleared up his views. It was explained to him with precision that the United States were free from every sort of engagement with France except those contained in the public treaties of commerce and alliance. Grenville asked if these obligations extended to the recovery of Gibraltar for Spain, and Franklin answered, "It is nothing to America who has Gibraltar."
But Franklin saw in Grenville a young statesman ambitious of recommending himself as an able negotiator. In Oswald, a man who, free from interested motives, earnestly sought a final settlement of all differences between Great Britain and America. To the former he made no objection, but he would have been loath to lose the latter. And before beginning to treat of the conditions of peace, he wrote to Shelburne his belief that the moderation, prudent counsels, and sound judgment of Oswald might contribute much not only to the speedy conclusion of a peace, but to the framing of such a peace as may be firm and lasting. The king, as he read the wishes of Franklin, which were seconded by Vergennes, thought it best to let Oswald remain at Paris, saying that his correspondence carried marks of coming from a man of sense. While Oswald came to London to make his second report, news that better reconciled the English to treat for peace arrived from the Caribbean islands. The fleet of de Grasse in 1781, after leaving the coast of the United States, gave to France the naval ascendancy in the West Indies. St. Eustatius was recaptured and generously restored to the United Provinces. St. Christopher, Nevis, and Montserrat were successively taken. On the 19th of February 1782, Rodney reappeared at Barbados with a reinforcement of 12 sail, and in the next week he effected a junction with the squadron of Hood to the leeward of Antigua. To cope with this great adversary, de Grasse, who was closely watched by Rodney from St. Lucia, must unite with the Spanish squadron. For that purpose, on the 8th of April, he turned his fleet out of Fort Royal in Martinique, and with only the advantage of a few hours over the British, he ran for Hispaniola. On the 9th, a partial engagement took place near the island of Dominica. At daylight on the 12th, Rodney, by skillful maneuvers, drew near the French in the expanse of waters that lies between the islands of Guadeloupe, the Saints, and Marie Galante. The sky was clear, the sea quiet, the trade wind blew lightly, and having the advantage of its unvarying breeze, Rodney made the signal for attack. The British had 36 ships. The French, with a less number, excelled in the weight of metal. The French ships were better built, the British in superior repair. The complement of the French crews was the more full, but the British mariners were better disciplined. The fight began at 7 in the morning, and without a respite of 7 minutes, it continued for 11 hours. The French handled their guns well at a distance, but in close fight there was a want of personal exertion and presence of mind. About the time when the sun was at the highest, Rodney cut the line of his enemy, and the battle was continued in detail, all the ships on each side being nearly equally engaged. The Ville de Paris, the flagship of de Grasse, did not strike its colors till it was near foundering, and only 3 men were left unhurt on the upper deck. 4 other ships of his fleet were captured, 1 sunk in the action. On the side of the victors, about 1,000 were killed or wounded. Of the French, thrice as many, for their ships were crowded with over 5,000 land troops, and the fire of the British was rapid and well aimed.
The going down of the sun put an end to the battle, and Rodney neglected pursuit.
Just at nightfall, one of the ships, of which the English had taken possession, blew up. Of the poor wretches who were cast into the sea, some clung to bits of the wreck. The sharks, of which the fight had rallied shoals from the waters round about, tore them off, and even after the carnage of the day could hardly be glutted. The feeling of having recovered the superiority at sea reconciled England to the idea of peace. On the 18th of May, the day on which tidings of the victory were received, the cabinet agreed to invite proposals from Vergennes. Soon after this came a letter from Grenville in which he argued that as America had been the road to war with France, so it offered the most practicable way of getting out of it. And the cabinet agreed to a minute almost in his words to propose the independency of America in the first instance, instead of making it a condition of a general treaty. The language of Fox was accepted by Shelburne, was embodied by him in his instructions to Sir Guy Carleton at New York, and formed the rule of action for Oswald on his return with renewed authority to Paris. Independence was, as the king expressed it, the dreadful price now offered to America for peace. A commission was forwarded to Grenville by Fox to treat with France, but with no other country. Yet he devoted nearly all his letter of instructions to the relations with America, showing that in a negotiation for peace, the United States ought not to be encumbered by a power like Spain, which had never assisted them during the war and had even refused to acknowledge their independence. When Grenville laid before Vergennes his credentials, he received the answer that they were very insufficient, as they did not enable him to treat with Spain and America, the allies of France, or with the Netherlands, her partner in the war. Repulsed at Versailles, Grenville took upon himself to play the plenipotentiary with America. On the 4th of June, he confided to Franklin the minute of the cabinet and hoped to draw from him in return the American conditions for a separate peace. But Franklin would not unfold the American conditions to a person not authorized to receive them. Irritated by this unlucky check, by which his hopes of a great diplomatic success were completely annihilated, he made bitter and passionate and altogether groundless complaints of Oswald. He would have Fox not lose one moment to fight the battle against Shelburne, and to take to himself the American business by comprehending all the negotiations for peace in one. Though Fox had given up all present hope of making peace, he enlarged the powers of Grenville so as to include any potentate or state then at war with Great Britain, and he beat about for proofs of Shelburne's duplicity of conduct, resolved, if he could but get them, to drive to an open rupture. Under his extended powers, Grenville made haste to claim the right to treat with America. But when questioned by Franklin, he was obliged to own that he was acting without the sanction of Parliament. Within 24 hours of the passing of the Act of Parliament enabling the king to treat for peace with America, the powers for Oswald as a negotiator of peace with the United States were begun upon and were completely finished in the 4 days following, but on the assertion of Fox that they would prejudice everything then depending in Paris, they were held back.
Fox then proposed that America, even without a treaty, should be recognized as an independent power. Had he prevailed, the business of America must have passed from the Home Department to that for Foreign Affairs. But after full reflection, the cabinet decided that independence should in the first instance be allowed as the basis to treat on. Professing discontent, Fox declared that his part was taken to quit his office. The next day, Lord Rockingham expired. His ministry left great memorials of its short career. Through the mediation of Shelburne, it forced the king to treat for peace with the United States on the basis of their independence. It emancipated the trade of Ireland.
The volunteer army of that kingdom, commanded by officers of its own choice, having increased to nearly 50,000 well-armed men, united under one general-in-chief, the viceroy reported that unless it was determined that the knot which bound the two countries should be severed forever, the points required by the Irish Parliament must be conceded. Fox would rather have seen Ireland totally separated than kept in obedience by force. Eden, one of Lord North's commissioners in America, and lately his secretary for Ireland, in a moment of ill humor, was the first to propose the repeal of the Act of George I, which asserted the right of the Parliament of Great Britain to make laws to bind the people and the Kingdom of Ireland. And after reflection, the Ministry of Rockingham adopted and carried the measure. Appeals from Irish courts of law to the British House of Peers were abolished, and Ireland, owning allegiance to the same king as Great Britain, wrenched from the British Parliament the independence of its own. These were the first fruits of the American Revolution, but the gratitude of the Irish took the direction of loyalty to their king, and in 1782 their legislature voted £100,000 for the levy of 20,000 seamen. During the Ministry of Rockingham, the British House of Commons, for the first time since the days of Cromwell, seriously considered the question of a reform in the representation of Great Britain. The author of the proposition was William Pitt, then without office, but the acknowledged heir of the principles of Chatham. The resolution of inquiry was received with ill-concealed repugnance by Rockingham. Its support by Fox was lukewarm and bore the mark of his aristocratic connections. Edmund Burke, in his fixed opposition to reform, was almost beside himself with passion and was with difficulty persuaded to remain away from the debate. The friends of Shelburne, on the contrary, gave to the motion their cordial support, yet by the absence and opposition of many of the Rockingham connection, the question on this first division in the House of Commons upon the state of the representation in the British Parliament was lost, though only by a majority of 20. The freedom of Ireland and the hope of reform in the British Parliament itself went hand in hand with the triumph of liberty in America. The accession of a liberal ministry revived in Frederick of Prussia his old inclination to friendly relations with England. The Empress of Russia included the government in her admiration of the British people, and Fox, on his side, with the consent of the ministry, but to the great vexation of the king, accepted her declaration of maritime rights of neutrals. At the moment, no practical result followed, for the cabinet, as the price of their formal adhesion to her code, demanded her alliance.
And now we come to the heart of the matter, the diplomatic game that would decide the fate of America. Benjamin Franklin, 76 years old, alone in Paris, facing down the greatest empire on earth. No army behind him, no fleet at his command, just his wit, his charm, and his absolute refusal to be intimidated. Think about what Franklin accomplished in these months. He kept the French from dictating American terms. He excluded Spain from meddling in American affairs. He played Shelburne against Fox. He made Grenville look like a fool. He established direct communication with the one British minister who actually wanted peace. And he did all of this while pretending to be nothing more than a kindly old philosopher who just wanted to see mankind happy before he died. The British were divided. Fox hated Shelburne. Shelburne distrusted Fox. The king hated them both. Lord North was gone, but his incompetence lingered. The House of Commons wanted peace, but couldn't agree on terms. The Navy had just won a great victory and wanted to keep fighting. The Treasury was empty and couldn't afford to keep fighting. Nobody trusted anyone. And into this chaos walked Franklin. Calm, patient, friendly to everyone, committed to nothing except American independence. He wouldn't negotiate with Grenville because Grenville had no authority. He wouldn't reveal American terms to anyone not empowered to grant them. He kept Vergennes informed, but not in control. He suggested Canada as a gift that would ensure permanent peace, knowing the British would never give it, but making everything else seem reasonable by comparison.
This was diplomacy at its finest. Not the diplomacy of threats and ultimatums, but the diplomacy of patience and positioning. Franklin understood that time was on America's side. Every month the war continued, Britain grew weaker. Every debate in Parliament made British resolve crumble a little more. Every letter from Oswald showed that reasonable men in London wanted peace. So Franklin waited. He entertained Grenville. He wrote friendly letters to Shelburne. He kept Vergennes happy. He called Jay to Paris because he knew he'd need help when the real negotiating began. And he watched as the British government tore itself apart, trying to decide who had the authority to make peace with America. Meanwhile, in London, the politicians were learning a lesson that would echo through the next 2 centuries. You cannot fight a people determined to be free. You cannot tax a nation that refuses to be taxed. You cannot govern a continent from across an ocean when that continent has decided it will govern itself. Lord North had learned this lesson and resigned. The king was learning it and hating every minute. The House of Commons was learning it and demanding peace. The British people were learning it and wondering why they'd wasted 7 years and doubled their national debt trying to hold on to colonies that clearly didn't want to be held. Even the Loyalists, the Americans who had sided with Britain, were learning it. Their property was confiscated, their neighbors hated them, and now, as peace negotiations began, it was becoming clear that Britain wasn't going to fight for them. They'd bet on the wrong side, and they were going to pay the price. The question wasn't whether America would be independent. That was settled at Yorktown. The question was what that independence would look like. What borders? What fishing rights? What debts? What happens to the Loyalists? What happens to the British garrison still occupying American cities?
These were the questions that would be answered in the months to come. And Franklin, sitting in Paris, playing chess with the British government while pretending to play checkers, held most of the winning pieces. Rockingham's death changed everything and nothing. It removed one more obstacle to peace. It brought Shelburne to power as the man most committed to recognizing American independence. It drove Fox out of government, removing the one British minister who wanted to control the American negotiation without actually understanding it. And through it all, Franklin waited, wrote his friendly letters, entertained his guests, and prepared for the final round of negotiations that would create the Treaty of Paris and establish the United States of America as a sovereign nation with borders stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from the Great Lakes to Florida. This wasn't just the end of a war. This was the birth of a new kind of nation, a republic, a democracy, a country founded not on the divine right of kings, but on the consent of the governed. A nation that would prove you could have liberty and order, freedom and law, independence and alliance. And it all came down to an old man in Paris, playing the long game, refusing to be rushed, keeping his cards close, and never forgetting that he represented not a rebellion, but a revolution. Not a temporary uprising, but a permanent change in the way human beings organize their governments. The American Revolution was won at Yorktown, but it was secured in Paris by Franklin's patient diplomacy, his refusal to accept anything less than full independence, and his understanding that the greatest victories are often won not on battlefields, but in quiet rooms where old men talk about the future. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the diplomatic endgame of the American Revolution, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. This is the history they don't teach you in school, the backroom deals, the personality conflicts, the moments when everything hung by a thread. And next time, we'll see how Franklin finished the job and secured a peace treaty that gave America everything it wanted and more than Britain ever thought it would have to give.